So hi, I'm Ankur from Zebpay, and with me today I have famous Bitcoin podcaster Stephan Livera. So Stefan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ankur.
So for the ones who don't already know you, how about starting with a short introduction of yourself?
Sure. So I am a Bitcoin podcaster. I am known just for interviewing many of the leaders within Bitcoin and also bringing a flavor of Austrian economics to that as well. I've been in the Bitcoin game for a few years now, and I just consider myself a bit of an educator and an advocate as well of Bitcoin from an economic point of view.
Great. So you mentioned Austrian economics. Do you want to take a moment to explain what that is?
Exactly. Sure. So Austrian economics is a school of thought. It's a particular school of economic thought that many Bitcoiners subscribe to because we believe that is actually a more accurate way to perceive what's going on in the economy compared to what we are typically taught in schools, which comes from a more Keynesian or otherwise interventionist stance. And what some key differences there are things around what we believe the supply of money should be, and also various views on the history of money and how money evolves, what is it, why do we use it. And we believe that by understanding Austrian economics, we can improve our perception of what Bitcoin is, and in doing so, get a better understanding of what Bitcoin is, what it's for, and where we believe it might be going in the future.
Interesting. And since you correlated so much to Bitcoin, why Bitcoin? As in, why should an average person who is banking over here in Australian dollars care about Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so fundamentally, Bitcoin should be viewed as this digital hard money. And ultimately, right now, it is a bit more speculative. And speculation doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It can be used in the sense that people try to understand, okay, you've got Bitcoin, which is this incredibly scarce thing compared to everything else. And fundamentally speaking, if this thing is so much more scarce and it's more saleable, it makes more sense as a money, it might make sense to take at least a small position in Bitcoin, because it's like this idea of an asymmetric bet that people can put down a small amount, and if they lose, it's not a huge deal because they didn't go all in, right? But if they put a small amount into Bitcoin, they could receive an outsized return. And part of the reason for that, the underlying reason, is that many Bitcoiners believe that Bitcoin is a superior money and that it would tend to win out in the market for monies globally. And so it achieves something that was not previously possible with normal fiat money. And so it may be difficult, though. I appreciate the point that for many people in the Western world, it may be difficult for them to appreciate why Bitcoin. But if you talk to somebody who's living in a more high inflation country, they will see the need for this much more. So somebody living in, let's say, the Zimbabwe's and the Venezuelas of the world may see more of a value to this idea. And in history, we have seen as well, when some of these countries go through their currency crises, people tend to go to something else. They try to go to gold if they can, or they try to go to the US dollar. There's this phenomenon of dollarization because they're trying to, because what's happened in their country is they see this monetary hot potatoes effect. As soon as they earn their money, they quickly go and spend it because otherwise they lose their value.
Yeah.
So Bitcoiners view it like, well, this is a game of hard monies and the hardest one is going to win. Yeah. And so in our view, in the same way that people talk about dollarization, we think of it like Bitcoinization, that over time, over decades, we would see an appreciation in the price of Bitcoin as more people adopt it.
Interesting. So if we keep the price graph aside for a moment, what are the fundamental characteristics when you say it's better than fiat money? What are the few characteristics that make it better than fiat money?
Yeah, so ultimately it has a provable scarcity, and through running a Bitcoin full node, you are able to verify that. And so the other key component is what we call censorship resistance. It means nobody can stop you from sending or receiving that payment.
Yeah.
I'm slightly oversimplifying, but essentially nobody can stop you from sending Bitcoin to anybody else around the world. And that is a very fundamental power that can be taken away if, let's say, a PayPal or a credit card can shut you down.
Yeah.
or a government can shut you down, but you can always accept Bitcoin so long as you've got a computer and an internet connection, and there are even ways to receive it without that as well. And so ultimately it comes to that ability of being able to send it around the world very, very cheaply compared to what would have been required to do some kind of settlement layer transaction. So if you wanted to move gold, it might cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, depending how much gold you want to move. It might take months. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can achieve final settlement in, say, an hour, and it would be a fraction of the cost of sending that much gold around. And so it should be viewed like it's almost like this settlement layer between big banks, sort of thing.
Interesting. And when you say Bitcoin is scarce, can you guarantee that it will be scarce?
So Bitcoin has a supply limit that is set by an algorithm, meaning that it will never go more than 21 million coins. And so what enforces that is everybody running their own full node. And that's a software that you can run on your computer and on different devices. And what that does is it downloads the full history of every Bitcoin transaction, and it checks that history, and it makes sure that there's been no cheating and there's been no counterfeit Bitcoins created. And what happens is when everyone runs that across the network, it enforces the supply, and Bitcoins are being released on a schedule over time, and so the schedule will finish roughly in 2140, and it will be less than 21 million coins at the full issuance once all Bitcoins have been emitted on that schedule. And in so doing, just by running a full node, you are able to verify the full supply.
So you're saying that I don't need to trust a government or banks to say that this is the amount of currency in supply. For Bitcoin, I can just go run a full node and verify it myself.
Exactly the point. And so that is historically what Bitcoiners are getting at when they're talking about this problem, is because historically, and it's not to point the finger at any one person or any one government or any one company, it's just that when somebody or one company or one government has had that power, they have tended to abuse that power, and they have expanded the money. And what that does, in some sense, is it raids your accumulated wealth. It makes it harder for you to save. And so let's say you go and work and you spend hours and hours working in your job, and then you want to be able to save that and store that for the future, right? And fundamentally what we have now in society is people go and spend their scarce time, right? We're all going to die someday, right? So we've only got so much time on this earth, and we're spending all this scarce time to make money on our job or our business, and then what are we storing it in? We're storing it in this fiat money that is constantly going down in value over time.
Because new notes are being printed.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting. So that makes me think that Bitcoin is similar to gold, because new supply cannot be created. It is, of course, mined, and there is reserves somewhere on Earth which is being explored, but no one can artificially inflate the supply. So how does Bitcoin stack up against gold? Is that a fair comparison in terms of supply?
So yeah, I think it's a good analogy for people who are new to Bitcoin to think to think of it like it's a digital gold in some sense. In some ways, it's not even that analogy is not accurate. So it's even better than that, right? But it's an interesting comparison as well. And I think many Bitcoiners would point out that historically gold was politically vulnerable and got centralized in certain ways that made it difficult for people to ensure that the supply was actually limited, because there was always that problem of, if all the gold is being stored in certain centralized vaults around the country or around the world, it's comparatively easier for that to get commandeered or co-opted, and for false inflation to be created on top of that. And so with Bitcoin, that's why we talk about this idea, and Andreas Antonopoulos, the famous Bitcoiner, also says, not your keys, not your coins. Absolutely. And so that is one of the messages of Bitcoin, and the idea is that by running your own full node and holding your own private keys, you are verifying that nobody else has created false Bitcoins, and you definitely hold your own Bitcoins. And so that's a real power, and that's a real benefit that we have with Bitcoin.
Interesting. And why just Bitcoin? Like Facebook's talking about Libra, we have so many other coins out there, and to anyone who steps into this world of crypto, they think wow, there's so many coins and all of them are new, part of this new asset class. So why do you say it's Bitcoin only?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well, and I can understand it's very confusing to a newcomer. They might think, oh, aren't you Bitcoiners just being really tribal? Why don't you just be open to all these other coins and so on? And I can understand that, like at a superficial level, but really what happens is when you dive into the detail, you start to understand a little bit further that many of these altcoins do not have the same security assurances, they do not have the same level of decentralization that Bitcoin has, they do not have the same kind of characteristics that make it a better money. And so we think of it, from thinking back to the Austrian school, Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, pointed out that we should think of money as the most saleable commodity, or those commodities that are most saleable are the ones that will become money. And as Ludwig von Mises points out in the theory of money and credit, there is a tendency for less saleable ones, by one, to get knocked away until we've got kind of the most saleable one. And so we would anticipate that there is a sort of convergence towards the best one.
Yeah.
And so that, in our understanding, is Bitcoin. And part of the question with some of these digital attempts like Libra is that they are fundamentally more centralized, they are fundamentally more easy to be shut down by a government or censored. So for example, if Milo Yiannopoulos or someone like that has been banned off Facebook, what does that mean for his ability to transact with Libra? Whereas anyone is free to use Bitcoin so long as they've got a computer and an internet connection.
Yeah. So that's a fair comparison between Bitcoin and other coins and other digital attempts like Libra. And while it's not going to be something which will be proven in a matter of days or weeks or even years, one of the logical questions which comes up in my mind a lot of time, there's often comparisons about that crypto or Bitcoin is like the internet in 90s. And the 90s was 10 years long, so we're talking about, definitely talking about in years. But when you say that Bitcoin will become XYZ, or it has a certain potential, at least it's a promise that is being made by technology, by community, by all the things that we are doing around it, and you are educated in the space. But what's the kind of time frame are you realistically, you hinted at decades before this, but what's the kind of time frame we are looking at for crypto or Bitcoin to become a natural thing for people across the globe? Like money today is a natural thing, paper money is a natural thing. How much time do you think it will take for Bitcoin or crypto?
That's a great question. There are many different views on this point. I think the most bullish of those views might be something like 10 to 15 years, and the more conservative view might be another 30 or so years, something like that. So yeah, I tend to think it's something in that 20-year time range or so. But what I anticipate is that we will see continued adoption. And as we've seen over the first 10 and a half years now, as we record this, that Bitcoin has been around, it has gone through massive adoption. And it has gone through these speculative waves, but if you really zoom out and look at the overall picture, if you graph that, it's up and to the right. And so that's my view, essentially, that the stock to flow ratio of Bitcoin makes it such a hard money that more people will want to acquire it. And I think we will really start to see big progress over the next 10 to 15 years on that.
So you're definitely talking about decades.
Yeah.
Wow. And so if we now segue deeper into Bitcoin, or there are layer 2 technologies like Lightning that we're talking about.
Yeah.
How do you see the relationship between Bitcoin and layer 2 technologies that are built over Bitcoin? And I'm not just talking about things like Lightning. There are some other things which you have covered in your podcast, like the mesh network, which couldn't have happened without Bitcoin, or in its true sense wouldn't have happened without Bitcoin. So how do you see these layer 2 technologies happening?
Well, that's the fantastic part about some of these layer 2 innovations, is that people can be free to innovate on those. So typically the mindset of like Silicon Valley is, move fast and break things. But with Bitcoin and with money and layer 1, we can't do that. If anything, it sort of needs to move slower.
Yeah.
But that's the benefit with layer 2, is that people can move fast and break things, because those innovations and those changes that they're doing on layer 2 don't really impact what's happening back on layer 1, so to speak. And so as you point out, there are a range of different ideas being mentioned in terms of layer 2. Probably the most prominent is obviously Lightning Network, and we should remember that every Lightning channel open and close is a Bitcoin on-chain transaction. But what that does is it means let's say I open a channel to you, we now transact over that Lightning channel, and then at the end we close it, and that is a Bitcoin on-chain transaction. So that will dramatically speed up our ability to do transactions. It will dramatically increase the customer's user experience when they want to pay with Bitcoin. There are some other ideas coming as well, such as state chains, and also, as you mentioned, the idea of mesh networks. So Lot 49 is an idea of having a Bitcoin incentive for people to run mesh routing and mesh nodes that help relay messages around. Yeah. And that may help give an incentive for people where currently there is poor connectivity, for example. And it may also help build resilience into the system. So let's say the normal phone or telecommunications network is down, that now there's an incentive there for people to go and set up mesh networking as well. So that's another that's another possibility there. And we've also got this idea of side chains as well. So a quick example there is Liquid by Blockstream, and that's an idea where people can, using a different trust model to what Bitcoin has, and people should be entering into that with open eyes, but essentially they're trusting 2 of 3 of the functionaries, and these are typically large Bitcoin exchanges or Bitcoin OTC broker trader desks, and in doing so, they can quickly and confidentially move assets or Bitcoin around across these different exchanges quickly, and that helps improve the overall liquidity of Bitcoin as well. So these are a few examples.
Wow. So we'll watch out for more layer 2 technologies, and at least me personally, I'm very excited about Lightning, and as Zebpay as well, we have wholeheartedly adopted Lightning and integrated it into our app. So looking forward to that becoming a payment mode. So I have 2 last questions for you. If you have to choose between, here in Australia, it is said that there are roughly 1 million people exposed to crypto at this point. If I have to give you an option to get another 1 million people onto crypto in Australia who will put in, say, $10,000 each, or I'll tell you there will be 100,000 people who will really understand Bitcoin and crypto, which one would you choose and why?
Sorry, so what's the...
So if I give you an option between having 1 million people who will invest in crypto, you say, and they will invest in crypto,
right,
or 100,000 people who will really understand Bitcoin, which one would you choose?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a tough one as well, because at some level, I think just having the sheer numbers would mean just more people buying in, and obviously I think that there'll be that convergence. Yeah. But I think, selfishly speaking, I actually think the 100,000 would be better. I really want people to really understand what Bitcoin is, and part of buying into Bitcoin is becoming what we call a strong hand or a strong holder, because if that 1 million people buy in, they might cause another run up, and then they'll all just be like fair weather friends who run away when times are tough. When really what we want is people who understand the mission and who understand what Bitcoin is trying to achieve, and they are willing to, what we call is lower your time preference, as in delay your gratification, and understand that it's not get rich quick, right. And it's not even really about getting rich. It's about migrating to a better form of money, and this is really the phenomenon that we are seeing play out. In my view, I would answer with the 100,000 people who really get it. Would be my preference.
Totally, wholeheartedly agree with that. And my last question is, so you have now transitioned into being a Bitcoin educator full-time. Your podcast is one of those avenues. There's also something new that you're doing. It's called Ministry of Nodes. So do you want to talk about what these initiatives are and how can people find you?
Yeah, thank you. So look, Ministry of Nodes is our attempt to try and localize some of the content for an Australian audience, but also just to write guides, and some of that is relevant for just global people anyway, you don't have to be in Australia. So what the approach we're taking there is basically to write some guides, put out free material for people that help them learn Bitcoin and learn how to use Bitcoin in the proper way, right? Like running your own full node, holding your own keys, things like that. And so what we're looking to do is also run workshops. So we're going to start with just Sydney in-person workshops, but we will look at doing things like webinars or flying around Australia if we get enough demand for it, and we will essentially teach some of that material. So any listeners who are interested to find that, you can go to ministryofnodes.com.au, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Ministry of Nodes, and that's where you can find us.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. So, in my view, Stefan is globally one of the best Bitcoin educators out there. So, do check out his podcast and Ministry of Nodes. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ankur.